Well, hello again. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with history, what happened in the past and so forth. But what you might not be aware of is the very intricate relationship between history and culture. History plays a large part, not the only part, but a big part in shaping how a culture develops and what values and so forth a culture tends to have. So, how history impacts culture and the lasting effects that can occur in a culture because of history are the subject of this video. So, as I said, history and intercultural communication have a really tight bond. One heavily influences the other. And so, what we're going to do is take a look at and use some examples explaining how history and culture are so intertwined and how history shapes it. Now, I want to be clear up front some examples that I may be using. I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong. I'm just talking about how this happened and this is a potential result of within the culture. So please don't think I'm saying this is good or bad. These are examples that illustrate how they affected culture. So, what are some of these things? Well, we need to look at some various different types of histories and how these can affect culture. So, first off, family history. Again, you might not have thought of it in this way, but your family has a history. How many of you have heard about, your great grandpa who did this or your great uncle who did that and so forth? All right. For example, in my own family, we have a strong family history of military service, right? I think I might have said in a previous video, not sure, but right out of high school, I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And I give a fair amount of credit to that, to the fact that my father served in the military. He wasn't in the Marines, but he served in the Coast Guard. But he died when I was 5, and the predominant male role model for me growing up was my grandfather, who served in the Marines in the Pacific Theater in World War II. So I think that's a big reason why I went that route. So, where your family is from, notable things they have done, positive or negative, can all factor into the culture of your family and what they do. Maybe, for example, there's a history in your family of substance abuse. So there's a culture in your family of being very hyper vigilant about that happening to crop up with a family member. So that's what we mean by family histories and how they can affect culture. Now, on a bigger level, we look at national history, the history of your country and how it affects things. So let's use the United States as an example. If you think about things, concepts, values that our country says we have, freedom, democracy, so forth, how many of those are rooted in the Revolutionary War? The fact that we stood up to Great Britain and fought this war to gain our independence, that independent spirit's very big part of our national history, as well as this idea of manifest destiny, the idea that we started as, 13 colonies on the East Coast, and now we go all the way to the Pacific because of this idea of westward expansion and this rugged individualism. You've probably heard these words before. No different than, in England, they still have a monarchy, but they've had a monarchy for centuries. So that's a part of their culture that, again, is dramatically tied to their national history. So, again, you see how these histories shape, inform, and leave lasting impacts on a culture. And these lead to various cultural group histories. Whatever these small or subculture groups are, they all tend to have a history of them that they've experienced that, again, can influence the culture. So, and what this can do is this can create power. All right. It creates something we call the grand narrative. Now, what this means, it's a big overarching narrative that tends to follow your subculture, that tends to be ingrained into your country or even your family. For example, have you ever had maybe an elder member of your family talk to you and said, you did this? And for example, the Smiths don't do that, or the Joneses don't do that. I mean, that's that grand narrative they're talking about. Again, in the United States, what are some of our grand narratives? This idea of freedom of choice, freedom in general as a concept, liberty, democracy. These are grand narratives that echo across our history and that highly impact our culture. And with that comes power, because if you go against the grand narrative, you're going to have a tough road to hoe, because you'll keep getting beaten back. Like, maybe some of you, for example, know somebody who's in a family that pretty much going back several generations, they've all been blue collar workers. And then you have this one child who wants to go to college and like be a doctor. How much pushback is that kid going to get? Like, what? Being a welder's not good enough for you. It was good enough for me. It was good enough for your granddad. They're going against that grand narrative. And so that can be a form of power to try to keep people in line or keep people in the vein of where they think the history should guide them. And this creates heavy influences to identity development. How you see yourself, how you see your interactions with the world can very much be a part of how well does it fit this grand narrative. And, how much about yourself, for example, do you say is because you're part of the Jones or the Smiths or the Green family? How many things about how you see the world are part of the fact that, for example, you might have been born and raised in the United States? In class, it's always interesting when I have international students in the class because they bring a very different perception on various things because they grew up in a different grand narrative with different histories and how they view things is different. And so they'll espouse an idea that to many of my students born in the United States is this insane idea, but to this foreign student is normal. And it's just a part of who they are. And so that's how these intertwine. Now we talked about, subgroup cultures and how history affects those. So let's look at a couple of examples. Again, not saying these are right or wrong, but I think you can see the link here. So first, big one, religious histories. Okay, religion, whether you are religious or not, is a big factor for several people in how they view the world, how they view the roles of men and women, how they view certain actions is tied up in religion, and how that shapes your view of things can be huge. For example, if you are Catholic, how much of culture within the Catholic Church is tied up with the fact that they say they are the original Christian church? They trace their lineage, they would say, back to Peter, the Apostle Peter. Versus, do you still have that within the culture of like Protestant churches that broke away with Martin Luther? Maybe you don't have that same idea. There's more of an independent streak because, again, they broke away. And this, again, can shape several things due to this religion. I'll give you another example. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with. I know your textbook mentions it. And that is the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, in my extended family, I have several people in my extended family who are Mormon. And several of them actually live in Utah. Okay? Sort of the hotbed or grand seat, if you will, of the Latter-day Saint Church. And because of that, there are certain things in Utah that are huge deals because of that intrinsic tie to the LDS or Mormon Church that you don't see anywhere else. For example, there's a state holiday in Utah called Pioneer Days. And that holiday celebrates the day when the Mormons, who were traveling west after the founder and their prophet of the church, Joseph Smith, was killed, were moving west to avoid persecution. And frontiered under the leadership, of Brigham Young, of Brigham Young University fame. And Pioneer Days is a celebration of when they finally crested the last mountains and arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. And in Utah, it is a huge holiday. It would not be hyperbole on my part to say it rivals the 4th of July, if not surpasses it. Schools close down, businesses close down. Every city, I don't care how small it is in Utah, has some kind of parade for Pioneer Days. It's a huge thing. And within that, again, going back to history, a big symbol of determination and the grit of the Mormon people in Utah is the hand cart. Now, if you don't know what a hand cart is, I want you to picture like the old Western horse-drawn wagon, but make it much smaller. It only has 2 wheels. And instead of being dragged by a horse, a human actually holds these 2 things and walks and drags it behind them. Now it's on wheels, so it's not dragging, but it's so intricate to Mormon culture because several of the Mormons who went to Utah took everything they had on a handcart because they couldn't afford horses. So you'll see statues and all kinds of things around Utah celebrating the handcart. So again, big thing because it's part of their religious history and affects how they view things and holidays that they celebrate. This also goes with the histories of certain biological sex groups and genders. And you can see this and religion are very much linked. In the United States, there's the idea of women's lib. but they didn't get the right to vote until the early 1900s. Many people often forget, or if I put it this way, and I know this is going to sound harsh, but it's historically accurate. It was legal in the United States, although there were several barriers people tried to put up. It was still legal in the United States for black men to vote before it was legal for white women to. Now, that sounds harsh, but that's historically accurate. So, what effect does that have on women, their perception within the culture? That backstory and where they are today. Same thing, you hear a lot of stuff going on now with gender identity. What's the history there? How has that influenced things? And this also leads with sexual orientation history. The fact is, when I was a kid, being gay was not accepted. When I was a kid, it was viewed as a mental disorder. You could go to prison for being gay. That's not the case anymore, but that is part of their history. And so, how is that time of, if you will, persecution affected in things they do today? Well, I would say an example I would use is the proliferance of Gay Pride Month and of gay pride parades during that month. The celebration of being LGBTQ+, probably as a result of that history and celebrating the fact that it's no longer there. Just an example, but I think you get the point. Racial and ethnic histories, big one. Okay, what is the history of being black in the United States? Well, it involves slavery and everything that went along with that. What about if you're Native American? If you were one of the tribes that was forced onto a reservation? What if you were Hispanic and you were out west and there was the war with Mexico and the Alamo and all that stuff? How does that influence into it? So again, I'm trying to get to the point that these all have histories that affect how they view things. Some other ones. Diasporic histories. This involves people who were forcibly displaced, like refugees. If you come from a refugee group, and I want you to think about it, because right now we have issues with this going on around the world. At the time of recording, there's a conflict between Ukraine and Russia that's created refugees. Same thing between Israel and Palestine. Those refugees that are forced to move, how does that impact their family history? How does it impact their view of the world? How will it impact their view of being secure if you were ever forced to move? See the point? How it can really influence that? And this goes with also the idea of colonial histories. Look, simple fact of history, colonialism was a thing. Certain countries taking over other countries and making them part of their own country, right? It happened. It wasn't great, but it did. But what are the remnants of that you still will see in certain areas? Okay, a great example of this is the continent of Africa, specifically Central Africa. There are areas in Central Africa where, to this day, the predominant language spoken is French, German, or Portuguese. Even though the people there aren't French, German, or Portuguese, that is a result of when they were colonies of France, Portugal, or Germany. And they imposed the language and got rid of the local ones. And so now, even though they're in Central Africa, they speak French. Okay, so that is an example of colonial history and how it's affected something in a culture today. Socioeconomic histories. Are you poor? Do you come from money? Again, what does that say? If I'll put it this way. How many very wealthy people can you think of who have had children grow up and decide to become social workers? A very important job, but one that doesn't pay well. How many can you think of like that? How many celebrity kids can you think of who go on to be school teachers? The only one I can think of, maybe you can think of others, the only one I can think of is one of the singer Bruce Springsteen's son decided to become a firefighter. Despite his dad's success and fame, he became a firefighter. But these histories of you being in this socioeconomic class, they create a narrative about what you can do, what you can't do, that's minimized in some cultures or maximized in others. In America, it tends to be more minimal. I'm not going to say it's not there. But there is this idea that goes with the grand narrative of you can start anywhere and become anything. That's a big part of the American culture and history and narrative. That's not true in other cultures. Right? In other countries, I've used India in the past, there's a caste system where you're born determines everything, which one of those castes you're in. So these, again, create a history of obstacles, of challenges, of opportunities, and barriers to you achieving what you want. All right. And these lead to historical legacies. Okay. What are the legacies? Even if something happened 2, 3, 400 years ago, what are the legacies of that historical event still today within the culture? We had the example of areas in Africa to this day still primarily speaking Portuguese, French, or German, even though they haven't been a colony for like 200 years. Bring it close to home. What aspects of American life or attitudes about what it is to be American are an historical legacy going back to the idea of the founding fathers and us revolting against England and winning our independence and the mythos of that and the grand narrative out of it? Okay. History, when it comes to culture, if you want to think about it this way, history leaves a scar. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but it is going to make a scar on that culture that's not going to go away. I mean, it might fade after a whole lot of time, but it's not going to fade easily. And it can be explain a lot about how a culture is the way it is and how it views things and why they tend to interpret things certain ways. So, from this today, I hope you have a better understanding of the very intricate nature of history and culture. You cannot separate the two. The history of any cultural group, whether or not it's a family, a country, a subgroup, whatever, what they've gone through, what they've experienced is going to shape that culture in any number of ways. Some probably good, some bad. But it is what it is, all right? Like I said, I'm not here to point out that this is good and this is bad. It just is. History affects culture and how you view things and interpret things. And I hope, if nothing else, you got a better understanding of that intrinsic link. So the next time you're confronted with a culture that seems strange to you or that you can't seem to make sense of, one of the first things I would ask myself is, okay, what is the history of this culture? What's different in the history of this culture versus the culture I'm from? And how much of these differences could possibly be contributed to those differences? And that should give you a little bit of insight into why those differences exist. That being said, I hope you got something out of this video, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good day.